So, moderating a session talking about T32 and K12s in emergency care research and kind of how these are training programs to hopefully develop the next generation of emergency care researchers. And so our panel here, we have Lynne Richardson, Bob Neumar, and Jim Holmes, who are going to talk about different aspects of the training programs, both from the faculty side and then also from the applicant side. All right, so Lynne, I'm going to hand this over to you.
Okay, thank you, Anna Marie. Well, we're glad to see these last two arrivals. Until then, we had you outnumbered, right? The people on the panel, larger than the audience. So I want to start by acknowledging Dr. Jane Scott, who is a very important person in terms of emergency care research. This talk was sort of her brainchild. Every year she makes sure that it gets submitted as didactic, and this year Jane could not be with us. So I did want to acknowledge her. Jane sent us her slides, but really I could not simply use Jane's slides. I am not Jane Scott, I'm Lynne Richardson, and in addition to my day job, I ran one of the initial emergency care K12 programs, and I now run an emergency care T32, so I guess that pretty well qualifies me to talk about the subject at hand. I'm guessing if you're in this room, you know something about NIH and NIH research, but maybe not. It is comprised of 27 institutes and centers called ICs, has an annual budget of about $31 billion. And as we looked at this, many of us in this room, a decade or so ago, emergency medicine was lagging behind other specialties in terms of how many emergency medicine investigators had NIH research funding and how many emergency medicine investigators were being trained with NIH-funded research training programs. And it was really sustained advocacy by a collaboration of a coalition of all of the professional organizations in emergency medicine that brought some attention to this subject and resulted in what has continued to be an increasing investment by NIH in training emergency medicine researchers. And the goal of this training is to create competitive, successful NIH-funded researchers. So I thought I would do a little bit of an introduction for those of you who don't live and breathe this. NIH has a well-established pipeline for training researchers. It actually starts in the undergraduate arena, which I'm really not going to talk about. They have programs specifically designed for undergraduates and post-baccalaureates. When you get to the predoctoral and postdoctoral level, which is really where our stories are going to begin. This then moves, so that's fellowship. Early research career development, this is the faculty level, but all of these are mentored awards, meaning that the candidate writes them with a senior experienced researcher who is their mentor. There are two kinds of awards in each one of these levels. There are institutional awards. This means that the program director writes a grant. They get a program with a certain number of slots. It can be only predoctoral and postdoctoral, or only postdoctoral, depending on the program you design. And then I, as a program director, get funding so that I have slots, and then I go out and recruit candidates to my program, and I am here doing that, recruiting candidates to my program. If there are any research-interested residents in the room. At the predoctoral, postdoctoral level, these institutional programs are generally called T32s, and we're going to talk a lot about T32s today. There's also something called a TL2. Those of you who are at institutions that have a CTSA may be familiar with this. So this is a kind of institutional training grant that actually goes to an institution, CTSA, rather than to an individual investigator. At the early career research development stage, so this means now you're no longer a fellow, now you're a faculty member. There are institutional programs, and the K12 program which was the first major NIH investment in training emergency care researchers, used that K-12 mechanism. I'm going to talk a little bit more about that in a moment. And again, if you're at an institution that has a CTSA, there's also a KL2 program, which, and everything I'm going to say about the K-12 programs applies exactly to the KL2 programs. So those are the institutional awards. There are also individual awards at each one of these levels that you can get. So for the postdocs, you can get an F32. So this goes to you as an individual trainee, but it's still a mentored award. You have to have a designated mentor. And at the early career development, the research career development stage, it's usually the K23, that's a patient-oriented research career development award. There's also the K08, which is more focused on data, and there's some special ones, K01s, and so on. I did want to mention briefly the K99/R00, affectionately called the kangaroo, which is a hybrid between that K level and the gold standard R level, which is the holy grail, which we are all seeking. And classically, we refer to this as a R01 level funding, but of course now there's a whole R series, and every time I open my email, there's a new R mechanism I never heard of before, so it's really become quite challenging to keep up with all of this. And then you go on to other categories of large grant funding, UO1s, which are cooperative agreements. So, but this is all at the independent level, meaning you no longer have a mentor, you are getting these on your own. So this pipeline has been well established by NIH and used by many specialties to their advantage. So let me first talk a little bit about the T32 program. So again, this is one of the institutional grants. The award goes to the program director. I'm talking about postdoctoral T32s. So this is a research fellowship where graduating residents would apply to this program. So they would be doing an NIH-funded research fellowship. Now, there are many research fellowships in emergency medicine, a couple dozen or so of them approved by SAEM, which are not funded by NIH. And one of the points of this talk is that it's much better to do it with other people's money, and those of you who are running research fellowships should consider writing a T32 grant and getting NIH to support the training that you're already probably doing for researchers. So this is 2 to 3 years of full-time research training. The fellows receive a stipend. They also have their tuition paid so that they can obtain a research degree. There's travel money, and there's a very little bit of money for research support. And if you are in one of these postdoctoral T32 programs, your goal is to obtain a faculty position and enter either an early career institutional K program, a K12 or KL2, or perhaps go directly to an individual K23. And I'll come back to sort of summarize these pathways in a minute. So this is the T32 program, and I think one of my other colleagues is going to talk a little bit about how you go about writing one of these grants. The K12 program, which is now, this is a career development award. So faculty apply, or perhaps when you're finishing a fellowship about to be transitioned to faculty is when you would go into a K12 program, but still an institutional grant. The money goes to the director. And it pays for many of the same things that the T32 fellowship paid for, 2 to 3 years of full-time support. They pay tuition for you to take courses. There's travel money. There's research money. And almost always the goal, if you're in a K-12 program or a KL2 program, is to obtain an individual K award, so that you move from the institutional program where you took a slot on somebody else's grant to you get your own individual grant to continue your research training. So there are several common and a few uncommon pathways as you move through these levels. Again, the goal always is to become an independent investigator with your own R01 type funding. So if you start in a T32 research fellowship, generally you would either go to an institutional K, or depending on the program, you might, during your T32 fellowship, write your individual K. But you go from being a research fellow to being on an NIH Career Development Award. Now, sometimes while you're in the T32, you might write an F32, so that's an individual fellowship award, sort of an extra feather in your bonnet that you come, so you come off the T32 and go on to the F32, and then you go on again either to an institutional K or into an individual K award. Almost always, if you're on an institutional K, your next step will be to write an individual K. You can go directly from an institutional K to an R, but much more commonly you go through the individual K to the R. So this is sort of the common pathway and how it works for an individual who starts in a research fellowship as they continue their progress to independence. If you do it this way, through these programs, all of your research training and career development time is paid for by NIH. Now, this is not the way we had been doing it in emergency medicine, but in 2011, NHLBI funded 6 K12 programs in emergency care research. And this was a large investment made by NHLBI to train emergency medicine researchers. Interestingly, when the FOA came out, it actually was emergency medicine K12 programs, and then there was some PC conversations, and it was changed to emergency care research, pointing out that it was multidisciplinary. And so if you did emergency care research, you could qualify. And indeed, these K12 programs were sort of the model of transdisciplinary training. There were emergency physicians, critical care physicians, surgeons, nurses, a whole array of scientists from different disciplines were trained together to do emergency care research. It was very successful. This actually was published. Craig Newgart's the lead author. Most of the scholars attained individual NIH funding, either Ks or Rs, and there have been, again, it's sort of the model for what NIH said that they want in their training programs. There was a smaller, watered-down renewal to the original K12 program. 4 centers were funded. This was a trans-NIH program, and that NHLBI said, we're not going to do this alone, and 2 other institutes, the National Institute for Mental Health and the National Institute for Nursing Research, kicked in some money to these programs. These are running now, but they actually, all of these programs have filled their slots for July, which is sort of the last class that they will take in, because the K-12s are a minimum of 2 years. So this, unfortunately, is an option which is closing.
There's one more slot.
Okay, talk to Bob. Apparently has an opening. Because if, for example, you write an R01 and it gets funded, or you write an individual K and it gets funded, you come off the K-12. And so this is how slots develop, because good things happen to the scholars. There is no talk at NIH, or at least no serious talk, there's some wishes in some quarters, about a renewal of this program. And we were told pretty clearly when we got the second one that this was going to be it. So the K-12 for emergency care research seems to be an initiative that is at an end, unfortunately. Now, why would you do any of these? And this is I'm back to Jane's slide, because you know, the reason why this is important is because without K or R funding and protected time, you're back in clinical practice full time. And I think at most departments this is true. And there are not many departments which are themselves subsidizing the training of emergency care researchers. And so it's really important that we learn how to tap into the NIH funding for this. And other specialties have a long history of training researchers in T32 programs. NIH funds 3,200 T32 programs across all the institutes every year. And some of these programs have been running continuously for more than 40 years. So you get 5 years at a time, and then you renew, and as long as you're training successfully, you renew, and you renew, and you renew. And out of these 3,200 postdoctoral T32 programs, there are only 2 that are hosted in departments of emergency medicine. Both of these are at institutions that initially had K12 programs and now have transitioned to this T32 mechanism, because this is not going to go away. You can write these forever. And so this is, again, we're back to Jane Scott's slides, because this is her message that I know she would want me to give to the specialty in order to continue to build research capacity in emergency care research. There's a critical need to develop more of these T32 programs. This is the pathway. This is the way every other specialty has done it, and we can do it too. I sat on this study section for 4 years, the one that reviews institutional T32 grants. I have a successful grant of my own that I wrote that I'm happy to share. You all should be thinking about writing T32 grants and getting NIH money to train your research fellows. This is my commercial. If you have a research-minded resident, I would love to see an application. And I have to say, you know, the K-12 directors, we talked a lot about how there was not the outflowing of high-quality applications that one might have imagined would be coming when we started. And I said, oh, well, if I write a T32, it'll be easier, because these are graduating residents. Hundreds of them graduate each year. But I have to tell you, one of the metrics that T32 programs get evaluated on is the number of applications that they get. And at this point, I'm going to be in a little bit of trouble at my renewal. And so I encourage all of you who are in the research mentoring business, please encourage your residents to apply to these T32 funded programs. Even if you don't want to come to New York, just send me an application, please. I'm not kidding. Because that is really the only metric I am worried about in terms of my renewal, is that the number of applications is not what is commonly seen in high-quality T32 programs, which I know from having sat on the committee. So please, if every department just has one resident apply, I would be golden. So I'm going to stop there, and I think Jim is next.
So good afternoon. My name is Jim Holmes. I am at UC Davis, and I was previously one of the co-directors of the UC Davis EM K12, and I'm currently director of the UC Davis CTSA KL2 program. There's 2 of us actually in emergency medicine that run are directors of KL2 programs, me and Manish Shah at Wisconsin. And just to let you know, I've been basically written or been on the team that's written 6 either T32s or K12s, a total of 6 T32 or K12s over the year. I've had 3 of them funded. I've had 3 of them not funded. It's good news when they're funded. It's sometimes good news when they're not funded as well. So if you're thinking about applying for one of these, there are some steps that you really should involve yourself with. And the first thing to do is find someone at your institution or someone that's not at your institution that has one of these. So if you're thinking about applying for a T32, I would talk to Lynne or Cliff Calloway or someone at your institution that has a T32 so they can talk you out of it if appropriate. And then I would talk to your grant office, and then I would talk, when you talk to your grant office, you should talk with someone that they will make sure they have someone to create the tables for you. So the biggest complaint, I think, is creating the tables for these training grants. And you need some resources provided by your institution to create these tables. Because if you try to go out and create these tables on your own, you will stop there. So you need someone devoted to gathering all that information to put into these tables, and these tables basically have lists of all your mentors and what your mentors' funding is, and their trainees, as well as the people that you ultimately will train. And then the thing to really do is look at the NIH website. You can get on the NIH website, that's the website right there, and it will tell you the success rates for all kinds. This is true whether you're applying for a T32 or a K12 or an R01 or a K08 or a K23, whatever NIH grant you are applying to, you should get to that website and look at the success rates for the institute, the type of grant. They'll tell you how many applications there were for that. They'll tell you how many successful and what the success rate is, and then what the total funding is. So this is I just cut the table for all the NIH institutes that fund T32s, and you can see how many, essentially all the institutes fund them. This was the last funding cycle, and the success rates for that. It's ultimately about 40% success rate, but that's because it's much, much higher for renewals than first-time applicants. First-time applicants for T32s, the success rate is about 25%. For renewals, the success rate is almost 50%. This is for K12s, and realize K12s tend to come and go as opposed to T32s. Those are the only institutes right there that during 2018 were offering K12s, and that's what the success rate was for that. And you can see NIDDK had one, a K12. They only got 2 applicants, and they funded both programs. I wish I could have gotten involved in that. And then the other thing that you should look at is this website right here. That's the address again, and basically that tells you what the scoring for T32s and K12s are going to basically be looking for. And you get scored on essentially 5 components: the training program and environment, the program director, the mentors that are in your program, the candidates that you're going to attract, and what the training record is, which is especially important for renewals. And you'll ultimately get an overall impact score that essentially takes those components into consideration. As for the applicant pool, you'll have to look at who do you recruit. It almost will have to be interdisciplinary at the NIH. You will have to have a successful diversity plan, and you will have to show that your applicant pool is going to stay in research and successfully apply for grant funding. The faculty that you will recruit, ideally these are R01 funded investigators that are especially funded by that particular agency. But you can certainly have R01 funded investigators that are funded in other institutes from the institute that you are going to, but it's best if they are in that particular, funded by that particular institute. Those faculty need to show successful mentoring. They should be diverse. And interdisciplinary is ideal. So we always think about doing things outside the box. So when we put our NHLBI K12 application in, we had faculty that you would never have thought of, like statisticians that have R01 funding that we really hadn't worked with, but we were going to put them in as part of the team. One of the big components is institutional commitment, so this is why you have to talk with your grant office as well as probably the dean at your medical school, and the institute has to be committed to training, and they need to commit additional resources to your program. For instance, lab space, money for resources, additional spots in the program. So maybe you're going to have a program that is going to have only 1 spot or 2 spots a year, but they're going to fund an additional spot each year. So we do that with our KL2 program. The grant funds 2 spots per year, and then the institute will fund another spot or additional years for scholars in that program. So we have a fair amount of institutional support for that. And then you will want to have administrative support both for day-to-day program as well as for evaluation of the program, and a lot of times that you can use money within the grant for that, but a lot of times you need additional money, and that will come from the institute. And then finally, realize the program, it looks pretty similar between sites. You'll need to show that there's a need at the institution for your particular program. You'll have to show how does the trainee benefit, and that they will come out a transformed investigator. So we are going to take people here, we're going to put them through our program, they are going to come out transformed to be a new, better investigator. And these are the steps along the way that are going to transform that individual during their time in your program. A lot of these, especially the T32s, you'll need a degree program, and then you'll need to define outcomes and measure those particular show how you're going to measure those outcomes. The program will absolutely need to be flexible to the scholar's needs. This is especially true for a K12 or KL2 application. That is, you will have people with different needs that one type of program will not fit. So we always say, you know, we will provide whatever the coursework that is necessary for that particular scholar. So I may take this scholar, may need a couple courses, whereas this scholar may need 5 or 6 courses during their time in the program. So the program needs to be flexible. And then it should absolutely be Goldilocks, not too much, not too little. If you're saying the scholar is going to do X, A, B, C, D, E, F, G, H, the review committee will say, see, that's too much. But if you're saying the scholar is only going to do A and B, that's not going to be enough. So you've got to hit the sweet spot on exactly what they ultimately will do. And obviously you will have diagrams and tables in your grant to help the reviewer understand exactly what you're writing. You should always reference your tables in your grant. So you'll have table 4 about the different mentors, and in your grant application you will basically say, see table 4, look how good we are, look at all these awesome mentors, and you'll describe it there. Highlight your strengths, explain your weaknesses, realize that the reviewers are looking for the weaknesses there. You should have already identified what weaknesses you have, and explain in your application how, even though they may see this as weakness, this is how we're going to deal with this, and this is how we're ultimately going to turn this in our favor. You obviously want to finish this grant well before the deadline so that people can review this. And I put people in parentheses or quotation marks because you want people that are in your grant office. You want people, I don't want to offer Lynn, but you would want somebody that has this type of grant to review it. Ideally, you have someone at your institution with a T32 in something other than emergency medicine and will review that grant to find things. Because, and this is true for any grant that you ultimately write, you are always too close to your grant. Everything makes sense to you that you have written in your grant. You give this to someone that has never seen it before, and they're like, this doesn't make sense, this doesn't make sense, and this doesn't make sense. And ideally, the person that's finding those areas where it doesn't make sense is not when it's under review at the NIH. It's people you have review it before you ever submit it. Thank you very much, and I'll turn it over to Bob.
All right, that's a lot of information already. My name is Bob Neumar. I'm Chair of Emergency Medicine at the University of Michigan. I am co-PI on our K12 program there, and I've reviewed both K12s and T32s. And Anne-Marie asked me to talk a little bit about both the characteristics of people that would lead a T32 as a PI or even a trainer, and then characteristics of what an ideal trainee might look like if people are interested in applying to be a trainee, or if you're going to lead one, you need to know how to find the right trainees, right? Okay, so I think that's what I'm going to try to cover. There's a little bit of redundancy here, so when the slides look the same as Lynn's, I'll go fast, and when the slides look different, I'll go slow. And how are we doing for time?
We are great.
Okay, good.
We have 20 minutes.
Okay, I always like to start with why. Why would we as a specialty want to invest our time and resources into these training grant programs? And the why is that I think in order to fulfill our mission to optimize the care for patients with acute illness and injury, we need more research in order to do it. In order to get more research funding and do more research projects, we need more researchers. And this is all about the pipeline of investigators that have the skills to compete at the NIH level for funding. And this just comes right off of is that the NIH Reporter, or is it, yeah, so from NIH Reporter, or no, actually this is from the Blue Ridge Institute. So this comes right from Blue Ridge Institute, puts out data on NIH funding for each specialty every year, and this is just the number of principal investigators in departments of emergency medicine that have our PI as an NIH grant. And this is limited in that there's divisions that aren't listed here, people that are, all the co-PIs aren't listed, but the point is that in 2010, there were 60, and in 2017, we're about 87, and I think we're almost to 100 in 2018. So the one point that's good is, especially since the K-12 program started, we are making progress, and that progress is pretty significant. But the other point is these numbers are really, really small, right? So there's departments of medicine at institutions that have more NIH investigators than our whole specialty has. So that's why I think this moving forward with T32 programs and other training grants are important, because we need to build the infrastructure to have this pipeline continue to grow. So Lynne sort of already talked about this traditional progression, but I'll see if my cartoon matches her. If you get into the T32 program, you might become a K12 or a KL2 scholar, might go on to your K8 or K23. Ultimately, the golden R01 is your goal, and then there's some alternate pathways that are less common but still feasible. What I do want to talk about that Lynne didn't emphasize so much is the timeline, because I think when you get into, do you have a question? Or?
Just one question
Yeah.
on the last slide. I know you gave
back
a
here.
whole number, and you had mentioned some dollar amounts. Do they convert this to dollars? Like what percent?
Yeah, dollars are out there.
It's all on the website.
Yeah, dollars are there. They'll do dollars. We're at about 60 million a year for NIH funding, and yeah. So that gets a little bit skewed because you get a big clinical trial that's $8 million or something like that. So the number of grants is and the number of investigators, I think, is the important metric we should be watching more than the dollars, because the dollars will jump 10 million up and down just because a big clinical trial gets funded or not.
And if you looked at, again, I know the number's really tiny, but like compared to other newer specialties, are we even in the ballpark?
So there's another way to look at this, and actually Roger Lewis and I put this in our editorial, and I should have added the slide. So another way to look at it, by age is one way, right? But that's hard because medicine's been around forever, so what's the denominator? But if you do it so the AAMC has a number of full-time academic faculty in the country, right? And you do a ratio of NIH-funded investigators to full-time academic faculty in the country, and we and family medicine share last place. An order of magnitude below specialties like surgery and pediatrics and maybe 20 times or 30 times less than internal medicine.
That's scary because family medicine, they don't do a lot of research.
Right. Exactly.
Exactly.
We do a lot of research, at least we think we do a lot of research, investigator-initiated, not funded, and we're still in last place with them.
Right. Well, I mean, it's not. It's a good story because I'll tell you. Is it okay if we diverge a little bit? So when I started, I finished my residency in 1993. So that's like, what is that? 25 years ago. So how many NIH-funded investigators in the Department of Emergency Medicine were there then? Guess. One.
How many departments of emergency medicine were there?
Right. So, we've gone from, in 25 years, we've gone from 1 to 100. That's pretty good. But the question is, what we haven't really decided as a specialty is where do we want to go? What is our goal? Do we want to get to 200? Do we want to get to 500? Even when we try to sit down at SAEM committees and try to decide that, no one can really come up with that. But that's what we need to do. I think we need to come up with a goal where we want to be. Anyway, so we got all through this. The one thing I want to emphasize on this is the timeline, because if you are going to be a trainee, one of the things we don't tell the trainees is if you're going to enter this pathway, it's going to take you 8 to 10 years to get to the R01, right? So 2 to 3 years for your T32 or whatever fellowship you do, 2 to 3 years for your K, institutional K, and then 4 to 5 years for your individual K. So we're talking about a commitment of investing in yourself. Really, you got to think about it as, I'm going to get started, and then, 10 years from now, I'll have my R01. And people need to hear that up front, right, if they're going to embark on this training program. Because if they get frustrated halfway through, everybody loses. So I'm going to take a little bit of a view from the reviewer's perspective when we talk about how you get one of these. So this is actually the template that the reviewers who score your K12 or your T32, this is the guidance they get on how to give you your impact score, which is your overall score. And if you look on the left here, I'll highlight these, it talks about the training program environment, all of which are important, but what gets the most emphasis is the training PIs, the preceptors and mentors, and the trainees, and then the training track record, which is if you're renewing, it's the track record of the trainees you had in your program. But if it's a new application, it's the track record of how other training programs at your institution have performed. So if you have people that you're pulling onto your T32 as trainers, they're going to want to know how those people did or how your institution has done with other T32s. So that track record is really key. So we'll talk a little bit about some of the criteria. So again, these are wordy slides, but I highlighted the important facts. But these are actually taken exactly from the reviewer's instructions on how to score. Okay? So when you write your strengths and weaknesses, the reviewers are asked, does the training PI have the scientific background, expertise, and administrative and training expertise to lead this program? And I think the thing about that is there's three really key components in there. You have to be an expert in the science of the field that you're applying for, right? So if you're an oncologist, you can't, apply for a dental T32, right? So that's not going to work, although I guess there's some overlap. But you got to be an expert in the field, and consider an expert in the field. You have to have some administrative experience. So you can be the best scientist in the world, but if you haven't run a program other than your lab, you're going to get dinged, and it's going to be a weakness in your scoring system. And then you have to have a training track record. So you have to have, ideally, more than just mentoring some people in your lab. Maybe you ran some other form of a training program, maybe a foundational training program or something like that. But those are the three key things. You're an expert in the field, you have administrative experience of some sort, and you actually have proven to be a successful trainer yourself, because you can't lead a program of trainers if you haven't been good at it yourself. The other one is you have to, and this I've seen people get dinged for this, you have to be able to commit significant effort. So if you have people that are clearly, the dean of the medical center, and they're signing up to be ahead of a T32, they're just not going to have time to do this. And even, I probably got dinged being the chair of a department when I applied for it, because I probably got reviews that will say, well, how's the chair of the department going to have time to sort of run this program? So it's a balance. You got to be able to show that you can commit a significant amount of time. And then if you're going to do multiple PIs, which I actually encourage because I think it can be very, very valuable, you have to provide a really strong justification, because I've seen them ding just because it didn't make sense why you had two people that had the same characteristics, the same leadership skills and the same expertise, the same track record of training. It didn't really make sense to have two PIs. So it's really good, and they make you do it. They make you designate the responsibilities, but they have a complementary expertise. So someone who has the administrative piece, someone maybe has the content expertise. And that's great for emergency medicine, because we probably don't have a lot of people that have that training track record, that have run other training programs. But you bring someone on, like for us, I brought on David Pinsky, who's been PI of 4 T32s in NHLBI, and for that, to bring in the big, robust training experience to be co-PI on our K12. So that's a really good, the co-PI strategy is really good, and find someone who's run T32s in your institution to come and be the co-PI in your T32. I don't know, does that make sense? Yeah.
Absolutely.
All right. So that's the leadership, and then the preceptors and mentors I'll spend a little bit of time on, because this is, again, the team you're going to assemble to train. The team has really got to be strong. And you heard about these dreaded tables, and I'm going to put some of the dreaded table headers up there so you can see the kind of information that you're going to have to ask your trainers to give you. But this is their criteria. So they have to have appropriate expertise, and they have to have funding in the area of research, because the trainees don't get money to do their project. Right? If they're going to do a project in this area, they're going to do a project that one of their mentors has money to do. Right? So if your mentors don't have any money to do the research, you're not going to get funded. They have to be productive, so they look at recent publications. And again, what I just said is research support directly related to what the program is, and they have to have a training track record. So they're going to ask not only who they trained, but they're going to ask the people they trained, what are they doing now? Did they get a grant? Did they get a faculty position? And that's all going to be in these tables that I'll show you. But you do have an opportunity to bring people on, and they encourage you to bring people on that are younger in their career, so early mentors, and you can actually, it'll strengthen your application if you have early career mentors, as long as you build in a program for mentorship of the mentors. Right? So you have like a mentor development program where you can bring in early career mentors, and that creates a pipeline, and that comes across well in the review, as long as you call them out and say, yes, these are early career people, they don't have a lot of track record, but we're going to develop them to be trainers. And then specifically if it's clinical trials, if you're going to have anything involved, that your trainees involved in clinical trials, you've got to have people that have done clinical trials, or else you'll just get torn apart, because you can't have a bunch of PhD scientists as all the mentors, and then you're going to say you're going to run clinical trials in the emergency department. All right, so these are the dreaded tables. So participating faculty members. So you have to get this detail from everyone you say is going to be a mentor or trainer on your program. And you know, some of it's just the basic data on the left, but if you look on the right, how many pre-doctoral, these are numbers now they want, how many pre-doctoral candidates they've trained, how many doctoral candidates they've trained, how many of them continued in research, so how successful were you, right? And then, and how many of them continued in research career. And then they also want to know what kind of grants they have. So they actually want the funding source, the grant numbers, whether they're a PI on the grant or not, the title of the project, how long the project is going on. So if you have someone who's had 20 R01 grants, but the last one ended last year, they're going to see that on the table, and then the current year of direct cost. And actually on this table, they add up the number at the bottom, and they give the funding per funding per trainer as an output of that table, and that output gets discussed in the review. So if you have an average $1 million funding per trainer, you're in pretty good shape. But if your average funding per trainer is like $50,000, you're not going to be in good shape, because again, that's the money that's going to pay for the research that the trainees are going to do, right? So you got to be careful on who you bring on board, because you got to find some people that have a lot of money. Okay.
Very true.
Yeah. And then, in publication, so then they look at the trainees and they say, you know, of the people that you train, so you got your faculty member, you got your trainee, you can't list if you list a bunch of trainees and none of them ever published a paper, it's going to be this big white space in the table right after the name of the mentor. So the mentor can like throw in, you know, everybody they interacted with, you know, all the residents they interacted with for the last 10 years as a faculty member, but if none of them published a paper, it's not going to look good. So that's for both pre-doctoral and postdoctoral. All right. So K12, KT32 and K12 applicants. So these are the people you're going to bring on, you're going to train, and you want them to be successful. So I surveyed informally by email some of our current T32 and K12 PIs to ask them what they think the key characteristics of a successful applicant into one of these programs is. So there's sort of some demographic track record things, and then there's some personal characteristics. So I'll do the track record ones because those are a little bit different for the T32 and the K12, and please chime in if I got these right. So T32s are pretty much pre-doctoral, postdoctoral. So these aren't for people that are at the faculty level. So these are people that can be in training. They could be in a fellowship too. And they're ready for a fellowship appointment a lot of times. They've had some previous research experience at least. It doesn't have to be at the level that you would want on a K12, but I think if you're going to sign someone up for one of these and they've never been in a lab at all, you're going to put yourself at pretty high risk, because it's not how good they did in their research experience, but they've actually done it and know that they like it. That's the way I sort of look at it, right? Because if you've never done the research, they might get 6 months into your program and decide this is not this is not for them, and they want to go back and be in the ED all day. So. I think they have to have peer-reviewed publications, and hopefully you want to find out what their writing role was on that, because writing is so important. And then ideally they've been involved in funded research, so not just sort of projects that have been pulled together on a shoestring. So for the K-12, it's really at a higher level. Most of the people that get into a K award have completed their clinical training. They're ready for their first faculty appointment. They've had I would recommend previous research training, not just previous research experience, but some kind of research training, whether that be in undergraduate or during their residency, or a lot of people like to see a research fellowship before you plug them into your K-12 program. So some formal research training. I would say first author manuscripts if you're going to be a K-12 candidate. Would you agree with that?
Absolutely.
Yeah, so this is someone who's actually not only knows how to write, but can get from the beginning of an idea all the way to answering the reviewers and getting the thing published. Because if you have to teach them all that from scratch, you're going to be way behind. So someone who's actually made it through that peer-reviewed process as a first author. And even if they've been PI on some small internal, like a resident grant or a fellow grant, then they've done the same thing for grant writing, been able to sort of get the initiative, meet a deadline, fill out a budget, all those things. You're way ahead in the K program if you've done that.
Yeah. And all those things that you need to go to the K-12 level, that's what you get during the fellowship if you do the T32. So again, that's the pipeline.
Yeah. Okay. So that's sort of just, that's the stuff you can sort of see on paper for the most part, but also get in asking questions about what they did in those projects. So what about the personal characteristics? So this was the more interesting responses I got from everybody. So this is some of my own ideas, but a lot of others' ideas I'll give credit to. So intellectual curiosity, you have to want to solve problems or answer questions. And beyond that, it can't be just curiosity to say, well, this is interesting, I don't know the answer to this, I want to find out the answer. You want to have enough focus that they want to answer questions that are going to change the way we deliver care or change patient outcomes. So having that impact on the field by the time that they're done. And really, you have to have a desire to spend most of your time doing research throughout your career. So if you're going to go down this pathway is not preparing the part-time researcher. This pathway is to say that you're going to do more than 50% of your time and often 80% of your time doing research. And where I found this especially challenging is some of the people now that are doing emergency medicine and then doing fellowships like critical care. So you take someone who's done an emergency medicine training, done a critical care fellowship, now they can work in the ED and the ICU, and now you're going to ask them to spend 80% of their time for the next 6 to 8 years doing research. And some people aren't willing to do that. Even if they want to be an NIH-funded investigator, they don't want to, especially if they're working in 2 clinical arenas, don't want to give that up. So you got to lay that out ahead of time and say this is what you're really committing to. And you have to be able to be resilient. You have to embrace failure, I would say. It may be better than accept failure. You have to be energized by failure and drives you to do bigger and better things, because if you get 9 times out of 10 what you try to do is not going to work. Writing, and I tell you, this can be learned, and so I don't think it's a disqualifier, but you're going to have to get to that point at some time. But if you're the PI or the mentor on one of these programs, and you have someone that can't write, it's going to be a huge time sink. It's just going to suck the life out of you. Because it's 3 or 4 times harder to walk someone through just teaching them how to write than to actually sort of mentor them on the actual ideas of the science. So I don't know. We should have like a writing entry test, I think, for some of these.
Well, I mean, you sort of do, yes. That's why you have them write in the application, and that a lot of people get screened on that. It doesn't actually matter what it says, but the way they said it and the way they put it together clearly disqualifies them from career and research. I do think, though, it is a learnable skill. Some people have more innate ability than others, but you have to accept if you want to be a researcher, it means you're going to be a professional writer.
Yeah.
And that,
oh, yeah.
You write for money, you write as part of your job, you write grants, you write, that's the job. So if you don't like to write, this is going to be a tough road to hoe. Maybe we could find you a partner, and I talked about this in an earlier session, that sometimes you can collaborate with somebody who's a really good writer. and make that work.
Again, you want to accept the fact that you need to improve your
Yes,
writing and be
absolutely.
willing to take the feedback and not get frustrated because every time you send something, there's more track changes than original text.
Absolutely, absolutely. But if they're really brilliant, maybe we can get them to ghostwriter.
But I would say that you can be a brilliant researcher and a mediocre writer, and you won't succeed. But if you can be a brilliant writer and a mediocre researcher, you can succeed. You can do just fine. So don't underestimate the importance of that. All right. So just briefly, I'm going to talk about track record, because again, if you're running one of these programs and you get all these people that come in that are highly skilled and everything, the way to sustain your program, you're going to have to renew it after 5 years. And you're going to then be reporting the track record of your trainees. So this is your resubmission. First of all, the people got to complete the program. So you don't want someone to come in who's going to quit halfway through. That's a real big ding. And then as you get longer and longer in your training, they're going to look at the publications of the research that they've done, subsequent training appointments, and subsequent career development of the people in your program, and that becomes part of your resubmission application every year. So your success of keeping your T32 program is dependent on the success of the people, really dependent on the success of the people that you put through the program. And if they do not succeed, you will not get renewed. I think that's
which is why you want a really strong couple of first classes. It's a 5-year grant, and you start writing the renewal in the middle of year 4. So basically, and I'm about to write my renewal next January. So at this point, I will only have one class of fellows who actually finish the program. So you want those first 2 to be really strong, because they're really all you have to write about. And that's why my observation on the committee was the first renewal is easier for just that reason. It's almost still all potential. Once you're at 10 years, boy, you better have produced some people who have gotten their own grants and so on. So, because then there's more of a track record. So think about that. If you do get one of these programs, that you really need to look for a couple of superstars for your first class, because they're going to be all you have to write about when you put that renewal in.
Yeah, and that's more about how successful the trainees are in terms of their scientific careers. And again, this is the table that talks about, this is what you have to put in for your trainees. Their degree, their topic of research, but their initial position, their current position, and what subsequent grants they've had. So that all, you have to list every single trainee that's gone through the program. So if you have people drop out, if you have people go on to just go full-time clinical, and there's a pattern of that in your tables, that it will be glaringly apparent. So that's all I had. I think this is sort of sums it all up in the fact that we're pushing 100 investigators that are NIH funded in the specialty. That is huge advance from where we were 25 years ago. I think it's nowhere near where we need to be or can be, but I think we've reached a critical mass of NIH funded investigators where we can start doing this, start doing institutional initiatives to sort of build that pipeline and bring people up to that level. And I think it's actually our responsibility amongst the more senior people that have been successful to embark on this endeavor of institutional training grants to build our pipeline. So that's all I got.
Thank you. All right. We are a little over time even, so unless if there are any questions, we should all go get our drink on at the night reception.
Burning questions.
Well, happy to stay for questions.
Yeah,
Yes.
if there are questions.
We'll be here if you have questions.
Yeah, you can come up.
Thank you.
Yeah.
I'm curious to hear from all of you who run these programs or experience running them. Aside from this, high-minded idea of growing capacity, what's the motivation for developing this program?
I think that's like asking a residency director, why do you run a residency? Because you want to train your professional progeny. I mean, it's why we're educators, and I actually was a residency director before I moved full-time into research, and it's exactly the same motivation. running a research fellowship is better. I get to hand pick them. You know, that match does crazy things in terms of who winds up in your residency. It's a smaller group. But you have to be committed to it. These T32s do not pay for your time as the PI. So it is a labor of love. It does obviously let you grow your team and your sphere of influence and your impact on the specialty. So if none of these sort of altruistic motivations appeal to you, then I got nothing, because it's hard work. It's amazingly rewarding. I mean, when one of my research fellows gets their K, we all celebrate. When my K mentees get their first R, I mean, that's why I do it, because I love that feeling. I'd love to see them succeed.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same thing. I think that if, for me, if you love what you do and you find it rewarding and you find that you can have an impact, you want to enable others to be able to do that. And selfishly, it does amplify your own impact, because when you're done and retired and looking back on your career, I think you're going to you may look back on some of the papers that you had, but it'll be much more rewarding to look back on all the people that are still doing research and changing the field, that you had at least some small role in helping them get there. So I think that's a big motivator.
I get more fulfillment out of my trainee scholar, whatever you want to call them, getting a grant or a publication than myself. So I'd much rather see them get a K or individual K or an R than me get an R. One, because then they have to do the work instead of me. But it is better when I see them. I feel better when I see them get it as opposed to myself.
Yeah.
We talked about how emergency medicine researchers account for $60 million in NIH funding. That's kind of discrepant with all the body of research that's pumped out every year. So what these other funding sources, these alternative funding sources, are those viable starting points and for research grant sequence to eventually get to K and R1, or is that usually
I think absolutely, and I'll say two things. So part of the program on my T32 is that I have all of the fellows write a grant while they're on the T32. So usually that's an EMF grant or SAEM grant, or some foundation funding, or an individual F32 just for the experience of learning to write a grant. The bigger answer is that the researchers I'm training now, it used to be when I was coming up, if you had NIH money, you had to be purely NIH, because, industry money was dirty, and, if you were a serious researcher, you didn't take that. This is completely obsolete now. I tell all of my trainees that they need a diversified portfolio. They need to learn how to tap into various funding sources to do the work that interests them, and that they definitely need to learn how to get NIH money, because there's a lot of it. It's high value, and your university likes it because it comes with indirects for them. So if you're in academia and you're a researcher, you need to learn how to get NIH money. But especially many emergency physicians have interests where, there is no NIH institute that is interested in what they care about, and so you do have to find those other funding sources. But all of them, I tell them, you have to diversify. Learn how to manage industry-sponsored trials. Learn how to work with foundations. I'm a health services researcher. Now we actually, sometimes you get money not to study it, but to do it. The biggest grant I ever got was not from NIH, but from CMS. It was a demonstration project. It was fabulous. I got to actually do the things that I had been thinking about and writing about for many years and prove that they worked. So you need a diversified portfolio for sure.
Yeah, there's really good, American Heart has really good foundation grants that actually model a lot after the career development piece of it. And even the EMF and SAM grants, those can be stepping stones to get K awards as well. So the T32 is not the only way to get into the pipeline. But I would say if you're planning, or your goal is to have a long-term career where you're doing most of your time doing research, the NIH pathway is the most proven method to do that. But there's a whole group of people in emergency medicine, I think it's a really important contribution to what you're talking about, is there's a lot of research going on that's not NIH-funded research, that's even done on, budgets within departments that's making important contributions. And, and even like site PIs on clinical trials and things like that, that's important, and we need people to do that. So for people that want to maybe not spend most of their time doing research, but part of their time doing research, there's lots of other ways to get training and be productive and make important contributions too. But if you want to like be saying that you're going to have 60 or 80% of your salary paid for by research grants, this is the most proven method to get there.
I started with an SAEM research training grant. I got some other foundation grants, and now I've had R grants from CDC, EMSC, NIH, and K grants from NIH. So as the PI, and so you certainly can start different paths and eventually work your way.
Yeah, you can come on to the NIH pathway, especially the K23 via other routes. Maybe you did a non-funded fellowship, but SAM approved. We are SAM.
SAM approved.
An SAM approved research fellowship, of course.
All right. The panel has outnumbered the audience.
Yeah. Yeah, you guys, thank you for staying.
How much did you pay to be?